order. Today, the committee has the annual hearing on oversight of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Director Peters, you've now led the Bureau for a little over a year, and we've seen some significant changes. In February, you dissolved the Special Management Unit, known as the SMU, at the United States Penitentiary Thompson, located in my home state of Illinois. When you abolished the SMU, you recognized that the program failed to meet the high standards that we should expect in our federal prisons. I applaud your decisive action, but let me be clear. Closing that unit should only be the beginning. I was stunned to hear about the shackling of people in custody in ways that left permanent scars on their bodies. It became known within Thompson Penitentiary as the Thompson Tattoo. A former warden has reported that over 90 inmates were documented with these Thompson tattoos. Scars from excessively tight and punitive use of restraints, and the director, I understand, personally observed some of this in your visit to Thompson. The former warden also advised us that Thompson was one of the most violent and abusive cultures he had seen at a prison in 30 years that he worked for the Bureau of Prisons. This is stunning, and it's sickening, and I take it personally. I worked hard to open that prison. It sat idle for 10 years when the state built it and couldn't afford to open it. We've made it part of the federal system, and I wanted it to certainly be a showcase in terms of creative and thoughtful detention. Unfortunately, it has become notorious for other things. Recurring accounts of rampant racist verbal abuse and extreme isolation at the facility are equally alarming. Unfortunately, my staff continues to receive reports about misconduct that are, to put it mildly, unacceptable. Accountability at Thompson and across the Bureau is absolutely necessary and overdue. You have stated, and I quote, "Our job is not to make good inmates, it's to make good neighbors." I know, and you do as well, that separation for safety is unavoidable in extreme cases. But we both know that locking someone in a cell for more than 22 hours per day will not make them a good neighbor. And yet, since our oversight hearing last September, we have seen no decrease in the number of people in solitary confinement in federal prisons. In fact, the percentage of people in Bureau of Prisons restricted housing is higher than when I held my first hearing on solitary confinement more than 10 years ago. I understand you have partnered with the National Institute of Justice to review and provide recommendations regarding your practice of using restrictive housing. I would commend to you and to anyone interested a 2009 article in the New Yorker entitled Hellhole by Dr. Atul Gawande. Dr. Gawande is now part of this administration in the Department of State, but at the time he wrote about the impact of solitary confinement and restrictive housing on the inmate's mind. We both know that the majority of women and men in incarceration today will be released at some point in the future. If damage is done to them mentally or physically, they will carry those scars forward back into society, and the likelihood of their success and avoiding recidivism is diminished many times by the treatment that is accorded to these inmates while they are in the prison. I've said, and I don't know if my colleagues have all joined me in thinking along these same lines, but I believe every member of Congress every 2 years should be required to take a trip to a foreign country and required to visit a federal prison. We talk casually about criminal sentencing here and what it means to America. We ought to see it firsthand and have the courage to face it, where it succeeds and where it fails. I'm hoping that we remember statements that were made by our friend and colleague, Senator John McCain, who endured unspeakable torture and isolation as a prisoner of war. 2.5 years in a 15-foot by 15-foot cell. What he said, and I quote, "It crushes your spirit." The same thing is happening today in our Bureau of Prison system with restrictive housing. As I said, I know that in some cases it's unavoidable. For public safety, it has to happen. But we've got to take a hard look at this. I hope that you will consider this one of your priorities and hope that you'll work with us to leave a legacy that is much different than what we've seen over the last 10 years and before. We shouldn't delay implementation of the Department of Justice 2016 report and recommendations on restrictive housing. This issue has been studied long enough. It's time for action. Making good neighbors also requires full implementation of the bipartisan First Step Act. Senator Grassley visited here this morning to tell me he had a conflicting budget hearing and couldn't be at this hearing. I'm sorry he can't. He and I both worked on the First Step Act, which was signed into law by President Trump. That has resulted in dramatically lower recidivism rates for those who have been participants among the general BOP population. Let's try something that works. The First Step Act works. Programming to prepare people to successfully return to their communities is critical to First Step Act's goal of rehabilitation. Unfortunately, there are significant wait lists for programming and over-reliance on staff augmentation that have made it more difficult for incarcerated people to access programming. If they're going to be incarcerated, and we know that giving them something positive to do and to improve themselves has a measurable impact on the positive side, we have got to invest more. I need your thoughts on how we do that. My staff will be visiting BOP facilities this fall to see it in action. It is my hope that we have your full cooperation in these visits. The Bureau's 140,000 employees have a great responsibility of safely caring for adults in custody, but they cannot perform their jobs if they're overworked and undertrained. More than 2 years ago, Bureau of Prisons awarded a contract to an independent consultant to assist the Bureau in making informed staffing decisions. I want to hear about the results of that review and your plans to address chronic understaffing. With your leadership, the Bureau of Prisons is moving toward a new course. You have shown you're adaptable to change and confronted some of the BOP's most pervasive and persistent issues. You've recognized there's much more to be done. Our federal prison system must fulfill its fundamental purpose, provide safe, humane conditions of confinement, and ensure the successful return of incarcerated individuals to their community. I now turn to Ranking Member Graham for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the idea that the prison population needs to be treated humanely, consistent with our laws and our values, and try to come out of prison ready to integrate in society. Those are all worthy things to be talking about. But preparing for this hearing, I am just astonished in how the Mexican drug cartels are integrated into our state and federal prisons. That the El Paso FBI field director said that cartels are actually recruiting people in prison to help their networks. In South Carolina, January of this year, you had 43 people prosecuted in a state prison that were linked to Mexican drug cartels. And this seems to be a very significant problem, particularly with the issue of fentanyl. We had a prisoner come positive for fentanyl in a federal prison. Staff members were exposed to it and needed treatment. So I'm hoping, Mr. Chairman, that we can, this won't be the last time we talk about how the prisons are being used by Mexican drug cartels to advance their cause. And another topic that will be discussed today, but I hope we'll follow on through with, is the assignment of transgender prisoners, biological males wishing to transition and being assigned to female prisons. I have a real concern with that policy change by the Biden administration, and I look forward to talking about that, but maybe this committee can come up with a solution in a bipartisan way. What can we do to combat drug cartels' influence in federal prisons?
I will join you in that inquiry. I think it's very timely. Let me lay out the mechanics. After I swear in, Director Peters shall have 5 minutes to make an opening statement. We each have 5 minutes in rounds for each senator. Director Peters, would you please stand to be sworn in? Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record indicate that she answered in the affirmative, and I give you the floor. It's all yours.
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the committee. I am honored to appear before you today to discuss the really impactful work happening at the Federal Bureau of Prisons. In the past year, I have visited more than 20 of our correctional facilities, and those are my best days. It's a privilege to meet our dedicated corrections professionals while walking the halls of our institutions, many of whom have filled the room here today. They are my inspiration, and I am very grateful for their dedication. With their important work in mind, in the last year, we engaged in strategic planning, we modernized our mission, vision, and core values, and we are now guided by the principles of normalcy and humanity and core values that emphasize accountability, integrity, respect, and compassion. We engaged in proactive outreach to members of Congress, members of the media, advocacy organizations, and justice-involved individuals while maintaining a collaborative, strong relationship with our national union. This strategic vision, along with clear expectations, has put us on a course for success. As you know, the vast majority of our employees are hardworking, ethical corrections professionals who expect those who are engaging in misconduct to be held accountable. We dedicated additional resources to our Office of Internal Affairs. We've collaborated with our law enforcement partners to investigate criminal misconduct and hold individuals accountable up to and including termination and prosecution. I have communicated clear expectations that misconduct and reprisal will not be tolerated. As you mentioned, Mr. Chair, in our special management unit at our Thompson, Illinois facility, we uncovered abuse and misconduct and swiftly shut the unit down. We are holding people accountable, rebuilding the culture, and changed the mission to a low-security institution. Yet, as you mentioned, we need to do more as it relates to restrictive housing. Despite our efforts to address restrictive housing numbers, we have seen them increase. We know restrictive housing, as you said, is not an effective deterrent and can increase an individual's future criminality. So, we created a short-term plan and a long-term plan. First, we formed a work group consistent of members of our executive team to review best practices from correctional systems across the country and around the globe. Long-term, as you mentioned, we entered into a historic partnership with the National Institute of Justice to bring an external organization in to provide further recommendations. As you well know, the work of corrections professionals is complex and challenging, often resulting in negative health outcomes for our employees. So we are improving employee wellness, including better access to resources, increased training, and solving our retention and recruitment issues. Compared to last year, we have a 60% increase in new hires and a 20% reduction in separations. Yet we are still not where we need to be, and until we solve this problem in whole, we must continue relying on augmentation and overtime. Healthy facility structures are critical to our operations, yet we have a $2 billion maintenance backlog, which only accounts for the most serious repairs. So we are contracting with an external organization to assess the overall problem. Then inside these structures, we are the de facto mental health hospital, the largest provider of alcohol and drug treatment, and we have nearly 160,000 patients, many of whom come to us with complex medical issues and chronic disease. So with these complexities, we must ensure that we are operating holistically as a healthcare organization. So we are seeking an external entity to come in and provide recommendations on correctional health best practices and implementing the principles of normalcy and humanity. Mr. Chair, we remain committed to First Step Act implementation. More than 104,000 individuals have participated in FSA programs and activities, and more than 23,000 individuals have been released. As I have said many times, I believe in accountability, oversight, and transparency, and I know we cannot do this work alone. Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the committee, I am honored to speak with you today on behalf of our dedicated employees across the country. This concludes my opening statement, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Director. And so the First Step Act was a brainchild of Jared Kushner and members of this committee. We came together and put together a bipartisan effort. Among the sponsors over time were myself, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Grassley, and others. The notion was that the prison experience should be more than punishment and separation. It should be perhaps a new look at life, a life-changing experience in a positive way. And our measurement for that is quite simple: recidivism. How many people leave our prison system and commit another crime, another victim along the way? And that's very basic. And I think the record, as I've read, and I hope it's the same that you said, is pretty interesting. We know that generally recidivism rate of the Bureau of Prisons population stands at 43%. 43% commit another crime after release from prison in the Bureau of Prison system. However, if they've been through this program in the First Step Act, only 12.4% recidivate, and 87.6% don't. That's dramatic. It means time well spent, resources well invested, not to have a recidivism situation like this. So tell me where we are in terms of providing the resources for more participation and whether or not we need to do more.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we always need to do more. As of the beginning of this month, we were offering over 110 structured activities. About half of those were evidence-based recidivism reduction programs, and the other half were those productive activities. And you're right, the data is very clear. I think that we are at a great moment in time as we pivot out of the pandemic, and we have institutions that are now thinking very creatively about the programs that they can expand now that we don't have institutions under lockdown. Furthermore, as we continue to tackle this recruitment and retention issue, you're going to see even more progress because we'll have fewer people engaged in overtime and augmentation, freeing up individuals to engage in those programs and those activities.
So let me talk about Thompson for a minute, and I mentioned it in the opening statement. How did Thompson reach that point? Such a low point that you had to virtually close the mission of that institution. And what happened to the people who were in that institution? Are they gathering in another place? Were they sent to another place? How do you know we're not going to have the same problem wherever they're sent?
Thank you, Senator. I don't know how an institution gets to that low point. As you said, the warden reported he hadn't seen anything like that in his career. I, too, hadn't seen anything like that in my 30-plus year career in corrections and law enforcement. And so those individuals who have engaged in that behavior have been referred for an investigation. Some have left the organization. Some are pending criminal investigation. Others pending administrative investigation. For those that were moved out of the institution, we are paying attention to them and their behavior. We also have really increased training at that institution. When we were able to shut that institution down, we really went back to basics, went back to corrections basics, and rebooted our training program there so that we could change that culture. Culture change takes time. I think changing that institution's mission to a low security mission will help in rebuilding that culture and making that change. And we will be keeping a very close eye on that facility.
How much do you attribute this to understaffing and augmentation?
Senator, I think that accountability is the most important thing. I don't believe that a lack of staffing and augmentation leads people to treat other human beings that poorly. And so for me, it was violations of policies, practices, violations of best correctional practices. And so I wouldn't want overtime or augmentation to minimize the egregious choices that these employees made in taking care, or rather not taking care of those in our care and custody.
I'm glad you took this job. It is historic that you're in this capacity. Certainly the first year I felt, I don't know if others shared it, I think they might have, that you were entitled to the preliminary opportunity to assess the Bureau of Prisons and to talk about change and maybe even initiate some change in that first year. We expect much more in the second year. What can you tell us?
So I think we have great plans for the second year. So the first year, we really did an assessment, developed our executive team, engaged in the strategic planning, as I talked about in my opening comments, which I think is really going to set us on course for some initiatives that are going to improve employee wellness, really focused on restrictive housing, and implementing these principles of normalcy and humanity throughout the institutions. We've opened our doors to members of Congress and others to come in and see what we are doing. We're collaborating very closely with the Office of the Inspector General and the GAO so that our doors are wide open to them in terms of oversight and accountability. So I think in this next year, you will see the advancements of our strategic planning, the change in our mission, and a true focus on our new core values.
Thank you. Senator Graham.
Thank you very much, Ms. Peters. I appreciate your efforts on behalf of our country. During preparation for this, my staff informed me that in 2022, a federal prison facility in New Hampshire, Mexican cartel inmates used contraband cell phones to help coordinate large-scale fentanyl deals in Connecticut. Is that accurate?
Senator, I'm not familiar with the individual case that you're speaking to, but I can say that contraband is something that we fight day in and day out.
If I send it to you, would you look at it and get back with me?
I'd be happy to, Senator.
How would you evaluate the effect of Mexican cartels or the relationship they have with inmates in our federal prisons? Is that a problem?
Our National Gang Unit and our intelligence officers across the country are combating gangs throughout the Federal Bureau of Prisons as it relates to contraband. Drugs, cell phones, drones, those are very difficult.
My concern is, apparently, according to things that we found, the cartels are actually running operations out of prisons, using prisoners to coordinate drug deals. Is that a concern? Is that real, or is that just...
That's absolutely a concern, and that's what our employees at the Federal Bureau of Prisons work to combat every day through our National Gang Unit,
what's the biggest
our intel officers.
policy change you've instituted to combat this problem?
You know, we work every single day to leverage new technology.
No. You say it's a problem. I agree with you. What's the plan to combat the problem? Do you have a plan entitled Mexican Cartel Influence in Prisons?
No, Senator, I don't have a plan.
Could you come up with
entitled that? What I can tell you is our National Gang Unit and our intelligence officers across the country have a plan. They combat this every single day.
If you don't have a plan, you're in charge of the prisons. So I just suggest that we come up with one, and if you could, in the coming weeks and months, tell me what the plan is, if there's a plan at all. Could you do that?
Senator, and I'm happy to talk about it more here today if you'd like as well.
Yeah, but I want to, we can't talk about a plan that doesn't exist. So let's do one, then we'll talk about it, because I think we need a plan. To the American people, we need a plan to make sure that prisons are not used by Mexican drug cartels to poison America. On the transgender issue, in 2018, during the Trump years, an inmate was assigned to a prison, male or female, based on their biological sex at birth. Is that policy still in place?
We have a policy at the Federal Bureau of Prisons to rely on a community standard of health care and make individualized decisions.
So that policy has changed?
So we treat individuals who present as transgender.
Question. In 2018, during the Trump years, the policy was to assign an inmate based on their biological sex at birth. Has that policy changed? Do you no longer do it that way?
That's correct, Senator. We rely on a community standard of care to make individualized medical decisions based on what is appropriate for that individual on a case-by-case basis.
So how many biological males who have desired to transition are now in female prisons?
I don't have that number top of mind, Senator, but we could get that for you.
Is it a growing request?
It's a limited number of individuals.
Is it over 1,000, under 1,000?
Far under 1,000, Senator.
Okay, I mean, how far under? Is it 10 people, 100 people?
Under 100 people, but I wouldn't want to guess beyond that.
Okay, so your testimony is that under 100 people have been assigned to female prisons that came into the system or came into the world as biological males, is that correct?
Senator, again, I'd want to confirm that number and
Okay.
get back to you.
Okay, when you go through the evaluation of what prison to put a person in, do you consider the safety of female prisoners?
Senator, safety and security, when we make those housing assignments,
Is
is
that in the
top
manual?
priority.
Is that in the manual of how you determine who goes where?
It is, Senator.
Can you send that to me and show me what section of the prison manual talks about assignment of prisoners when it comes to the transgender issue, focuses on safety of female prisoners?
We can.
That's in the manual.
The safety of those in our care and custody.
No,
and-
it talks about the safety of the person requesting transition. It doesn't talk about the safety of people in the jail where they will go. If I'm wrong, please correct me.
Senator, I do not have the language of the manual memorized in order to recite it
No,
back to you here today, but what I can
I understand
tell you-
that. You changed the policy. I just want to know how it works, and I want to know what the numbers are. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Peters, this is not the first time that I will be mentioning the fact that Hawaii does not have a reentry halfway house. So in 2019, the only residential reentry facility in Hawaii, Mahoney Holly, closed its doors. And I don't need to tell you how important reentry programs are for successful reintegration into the community. And in fact, a recent report by the National Institute of Justice talked about the importance of of these reentry programs, because having grown accustomed to the stringent protocols in a prison, reentry can often become overwhelming as a previously incarcerated person adjusts back to society, and this definitely has a connection to recidivism. So, since we're very focused on the lowering recidivism, I think the importance of allowing a person to go through the reentry program becomes ever more important. So, in 2019, and I have been contacted by persons who have pointed out the lack of a reentry program, and I just want to mention in 2019, a Hawaii resident incarcerated at the Women's Federal Prison Camp in Phoenix, Arizona, reached out to my office, and she expressed dismay that Mahoney Holly was closing because it meant there would be nowhere for her to go when she was ready to transition back to society. And she asked, what is going to happen to all of us prisoners from Hawaii and Guam? 4 years later, we still do not have an answer for her. In 2020, my office was contacted by a woman whose husband was sentenced to a halfway house in Oregon because there was nowhere for him to go in Hawaii. I know that the Bureau of Prisons has issued a request for proposals numerous times. And since you have not been getting any responses to that, have you determined what is the reason that you have not gotten any responses to your RFPs? And could one of the reasons be that there's some sort of a requirement that the program, that is the people running the program have to own the facility? Is that a limiting, or is that a factor in why you have not gotten any responses to your numerous RFPs for a reentry facility in Hawaii?
Thank you, Senator. Well, this is very important to me. I know that you mentioned this during the last hearing a year ago, and this is something that we have been working on. In fact, I have a trip planned to visit your district, to meet with local law enforcement, meet with the judges, and meet with the community and your staff in order to better understand this issue. We have received notice that the Day Reporting Center, it looks like that is going to be under contract, and so we're hoping that that is going to be a small step in the right direction, but we need a residential reentry center on the island. And so our hope is that we are going to be able to work together to solve this problem. Your comments are spot on. Having that local residential reentry center for the citizens of Hawaii is
Okay,
incredibly
at this
important.
point, Director Peters, it has been 4 years, and so at this point, I'd like to get to what is it that is resulting in a lack of a facility in Hawaii? And I'm not blaming the Bureau of Prisons. Perhaps we need to work with the state of Hawaii because the previous people who were running the facility had leased the space from the state, and maybe we need to work with the state of Hawaii to provide the property, some kind of a resolution to this situation so that we can have a better response for the people who have been contacting me. I just want to also mention that regarding the treatment of transgender prisoners, you do have a statutory mandate to provide for the safekeeping and provide for the protection of all people in BFP's custody. And that also means that you do need to take into consideration a transgender prisoner's views on his or her own safety. And that weighs in the decision of how to provide for the safety of that person. Is that not so?
That is absolutely correct, Senator. We take into account their views as well as everyone's views on where they think that they can be better served from a safety security perspective or a programming and treatment perspective. And we take safety and security of the assignment of those individuals very seriously.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Grassley?
Thank you and welcome to the committee. On December 2022 hearing on sexual abuse of inmates in federal prisons, you testified that contraband is beginning of sexual assault. Those few words are a quote from you. Inspector General Horowitz agreed and asked for increased penalties for contraband smuggling. Do you agree with Inspector General Horowitz's request for increased penalties?
He and I have discussed that. I think that every tool needs to be considered in order to combat this significant issue of contraband, and I think this would be an additional tool in our toolbox.
Okay. In your professional opinion, could giving design drawings for U.S.-based correctional facilities to foreign officials who work for cartels threaten American security?
Senator, we would want those floor plans very secured. A release of anything like that would be a serious security concern at the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
Okay. Last week, I released a 76-page report on foreign operations in Mexico disclosing the Colorado Department of Corrections, in coordination with the State Department, agreed to share drawings from Colorado State Penitentiary 1 facilities with Mexico's Secretary of Public Security. We know now that certain Secretary of Public Security leadership was working with the Sinaloa cartel. I'm asking if you could investigate what information the United States gave the Mexican government about U.S.-based correctional facilities and assess the impact on Bureau of Prison Security.
Senator, I don't know that I would be the appropriate component or entity to investigate what information was exchanged. What I can tell you as the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, we would be very careful of whom we shared our blueprints and designs with as it relates to safety and security.
I like the last half of your question. In regard to the first half, you said you couldn't go to the State Department and get that information?
I'm not saying I can't. I'm not sure I'm the right entity to investigate that situation in Colorado.
Well, I think you'd want to know if our own government would be involved in sharing information on prisons generally, because they might be doing it for prisons under your leadership.
I can certainly look into it, Senator, and get back to you.
Okay. Well, if you look into it, I'd like to know what you find out. And if you get the information that I've been trying to get, I'd sure like to have it. So I hope you'll share that with us. But tell us one way or the other if you can get that information. And if you can't get it, tell me why you can't get it. because I think it's very important that you know whether our government is sharing information on our prison layouts with a foreign country. According to the Department of Justice Inspector General report from this year, it found that inmate on staff sexual misconduct is widespread across the Bureau of Prison Facilities and primarily affects female employees. The report also found that in 2021, there were 2,047 sustained allegations of inmate on staff sexual assaults based on 5 categories of offenses, yet the Bureau of Prison only used 2 categories of offenses in its First Step Act report and identified 7 sustained allegations. There is a significant difference. So, Madam Director, please explain why the Bureau of Prisons didn't use the same category of offenses as the Inspector General, and what steps has the Bureau of Prison taken to ensure its data is full and complete so that future First Step Act reports offer Congress a full picture?
Thank you, Senator. I'll have to look at the coding and get back to you on that discrepancy, but what I can tell you is sexual misconduct by the individuals in our custody against our employees will not be tolerated. Not only are we working to hold them accountable, the Deputy Attorney General and I have met with all of the U.S. attorneys on multiple occasions to ask for a criminal prosecution of these individuals in order to send a clear message that not only are we going to hold them accountable administratively through our Federal Bureau of Prison sanctions, but we want them held accountable criminally as well.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Welch.
Thank you. Director Peters, thank you, and I appreciated your visit that we had some months ago. I wanted to talk about reentry centers. They're incredibly important. You know, most people who go to prison ultimately get out of prison, and my colleague from Hawaii was mentioning, the reentry centers are extraordinarily helpful for folks to not be repeat offenders. We don't have one in Vermont. My understanding is that we've been told that the Bureau has conducted a market study, and in fact, that study indicates Vermont needs a reentry center, but nothing is available. I certainly think we do need a reentry center. Do you support establishing a reentry center in Vermont?
Thank you, Senator, and I too appreciated our conversation in your office, so thank you. And I do support it, and just as of yesterday, hot off the press, I have good news to report. We have issued an RFP for Burlington, Vermont, to try and get a residential reentry center in your state.
Well, thank you for that news. So tell me what that means specifically.
That means that we're asking for individuals to come forward and respond to that request for proposal and engage in a contract with us. So it's my hope that even discussing it today will encourage people who are listening to apply for that RFP and be willing to run a residential reentry center in Vermont.
Okay, thank you for that news. The other point I want to focus on is the programming to help reduce recidivism. And there's been many studies, as you know, that show programs that offer the largest reduction in recidivism are for secondary and post-secondary education. It's hard, but it's helpful. And studies have shown also that these are very cost-effective. If you have less recidivism, then that's less of a burden on the Bureau of Prisons. And as part of the First Step Act, as you know, again, the Bureau of Prisons is required to introduce evidence-based recidivism reductions for federal inmates. My question is, what percentage of programming has reopened since the height of the COVID pandemic?
Thank you, Senator. I don't know the percentage that is reopened post-COVID, but I can tell you as of September 1st, we had over 110 evidence-based recidivism reduction programs and productive activities. And I know that when I visit our institutions, they're reporting additional expansions and additional ideas. So I know that number will continue to grow.
So could you describe the steps that the Bureau is taking to integrate GED, secondary and post-secondary education into the evidence-based recidivism reduction program?
So we're very proud of our GED program at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and as it relates to secondary education, we're very excited for the expansion of Pell Grants, which Congress approved and became effective in July. So we have been working with our local community community colleges to apply for that Pell Grant status so that they can assist us in expanding our post-secondary efforts under the new expanded Pell Grants.
So could you just explain how the process works for an inmate? I'm an inmate, and I am now in one of your facilities. How is it that I get into, or am encouraged to get into, an education program?
You know, their unit manager and their counselor would work on their case plan and what they're capable of and what their goals are, and then they would hold their hand and walk them through the application process and getting them involved in that GED program or that secondary education program.
Can you just describe what some of the impediments are? Some may be because of the inmates, some may be because of the resources, but what are the impediments to participation in the program?
Readiness for the adults in custody to be academically ready to get through the GED and then academically ready for secondary, post-secondary education. The other impediments are having local resources available, the community colleges, to provide that secondary education. But I believe that the expansion of the Pell Grants is going to help us get over that hurdle as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Welch. Senator Cotton.
Ms. Peters, it came to my attention that members of this committee submitted written questions the last time you appeared, and I don't think we've gotten responses back. Are you aware of that?
I am, Senator.
Can we count on getting responses to those questions soon?
We are working diligently to get those responses back to you.
What's been the long delay?
You know, it's been a long process. We always want to get these answers right, and there's a review process going back and forth between the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the department to ensure that our answers are consistent with department
Can we get a date certain, like maybe a month from today, October 13th?
Senator, I would love a date certain. Unfortunately, I cannot provide that to
So
you.
no, and I assume you won't provide a date certain any new questions we have then either, right?
That's correct, Senator.
All right, you mentioned in your opening statement you talked to stakeholders and something called justice-involved individuals. What's a justice-involved individual?
Someone who has been involved in the criminal justice system.
So a criminal.
Criminal or victims. We had a listening session
Okay.
where victims also discussed the impact of the
Is there a
criminal
reason we don't
justice
just call
system
them criminals and victims?
Pardon me?
Is there a reason we don't just use plain English and call them criminals and victims?
Justice-involved individuals is a term that I use regularly.
Okay. You said that you'd been to 20 prisons in the last 12 months. That's about once every 2.5 weeks. On average, how many hours do you spend in a correctional facility when you visit it?
Probably 6 or more hours when I'm visiting.
Okay, so close to a full working day when you're there.
Yes.
How many of those hours do you spend on average with your correctional officers?
Well, when I am there, I spend about an hour with my executive team that's on the ground locally, and then the rest of it is walking the halls of the institution. And I try to stop and talk to every correctional officer.
Any organized sit-down with correctional officers?
We had an organized sit-down with our national union, but it's more walking and talking and meeting with them one-on-one at their post. I prefer that over pulling them off their post to have a conversation.
Got it. Have you visited the Forest City, Arkansas institution?
No, I have not.
Would you like to join me on a visit there?
I'd be happy to join you on a visit.
Because, you know, the incoming union chief who's taking over from Shane Fauci, Brandy White, is an officer at Forest City. I wish we would have had a second panel today with them. We had one last year, but I guess the chairman didn't want to have a second panel with the union members today. I want to touch this augmentee issue. Last year, we passed a law that required your employees to spend 90% of their time on their primary responsibility. If you're a correctional officer, 90% on corrections. If you're an HVAC technician, 90% on HVAC. What is the status today of the 90% requirement? Are you meeting that requirement?
We are working hard to meet that requirement.
That sounds like a no.
And so we are continuing to battle our recruitment and retention
80%?
issues. I don't have,
70%?
yeah, I don't have an overall number for you, Senator.
How can you not have an overall number of what your core officers are doing? Not research associates, not administrative assistants, but these, like this, they perform the mission of your organization, and you don't know how much time they're spending?
Senator, it changes every day and is different at every
There's got
single
to be an average,
institution.
though.
I don't have an average, Senator.
I mean, hitters go over 4 in a day, but they can still hit 350 in the season. There's got to be an average. I'm disappointed you don't have an average. This is not, it's not like some political hot potato. I'm not asking you about men who claim to be women to go into women's prisons. This is like a core responsibility of your organization. Let's turn to why you're not meeting that staffing numbers. You said in your written testimony that you're at 88% funded positions. How many correctional officer positions did the president request and Congress authorize and fund for 2023?
Senator, I don't have that number in front of me, but we can certainly get back to you.
20,446. Do you know what it was last year?
No, Senator.
20,446. How many correctional officers are currently employed?
Like you just mentioned, the percentage is 88% of the
No,
funded
correctional
numbers.
officers, not total slots, correctional officers. How many do you have?
I don't have that number in front of me, but I can get it and get back to you, Senator.
Ms. Peters, again, these are your primary employees. These are the meat eaters, not the leaf eaters that do all the other jobs. And you don't know how many you have employed? Do you think it's, if you have 20,446 authorized, do you think it's 18,000?
Senator, I know that the number is 88% of those funded positions.
No, that's your total positions.
Yes.
Do you think it's closer to 8,000 or 18,000 correctional officers?
I think it's closer to 18,000, but we can get that number and get back to you.
Kind of right in the middle, maybe a little on the verging towards 8,000. It's 12,731, which say 60% that you had authorized for last year and this year. Yet you're boasting of an 88% total employment rate. And then you're complaining that you don't have enough officers to meet the 90% requirement that we mandated, that President Biden signed into law. It sounds to me like you need to spend a lot more time and money focused on hiring the people who are performing your organization's chief responsibility and less support personnel. Why is your organization at 88% total, but your core job only at 60%?
So, Senator, I don't know what that number is, so I'm not going to say on the record that it's 60%, but we'll get that number and get back to you. But I will tell you the majority of our recruitment efforts over the last year has been for those correctional officers.
But you're not meeting it. You're at 88% for overall employees, which includes all those leaf eaters I mentioned. You're at barely 60% for your meat eaters, the people who are doing the main mission of your job. It seems, my time's up here, but it seems to me like the BOP needs to do a much better job recruiting and hiring corrections officers, since that is what you actually do is corrections, and much less time hiring all these other support personnel and headquarters personnel. I look forward to seeing you in Forest City.
Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Director Peters, good to see you again.
Thank you, Senator. Good to see you.
You entered this post with a reputation as a reformer. When you took this job, you expressed to this committee, to the Permanent Subcommittee of Investigations, and to the public your commitment to reform. And I said to you at that time that the question is whether or not you would deliver. You've now been in the post for about a year, and Congress expects results. I want to begin by talking about the sexual assault of female inmates in BOP custody. Investigation I led at the Permanent Subcommittee of Investigations last year found that in 2/3 of BOP institutions that housed female inmates had been sexually assaulted by members of staff. What specific steps have you taken in the last year to end the sexual assault of BOP inmates?
A whole host of things, Senator. So we have engaged in cultural assessments at all of our female facilities. We've brought in external consultants to help us engage in trauma-informed care and gender responsivity. The most important thing that we've done is work to hold those who have engaged in that abuse accountable. The Deputy Attorney General herself has visited our facilities and launched a Safer Teams review of our female facilities across this country and brought forth recommendations that we we are also implementing. We continue to work with law enforcement and U.S. attorneys to hold those individuals accountable and continue to increase our training so that when we hire the right people on the front end, they are then trained to do their job.
Okay, let's talk about two specific deficiencies that we had identified in the PSI report. One, the efficacy of PREA audits. At institutions that had passed their PREA audits, there was nevertheless widespread sexual assault. At one institution that had passed its PREA audit, the warden and the chaplain were later found to have raped inmates. Yes. What steps have you taken to ensure that the PREA audits identify indicators of sexual assault in prisons?
So the PREA audit is based on the standards put forth across the country for all correctional facilities, and they did great things. They did things like ensure that reporting structures were in place, that oversight was in place, that individuals were given information around their right to be safe. Unfortunately, PREA doesn't predict future behavior, and so our work is in hiring the right people, training the right people, and when they do act in this egregious criminal way, to hold them accountable.
Have any changes been made to the process by which BOP contracts for these PREA audits, reviews these PREA audits?
No, Senator.
Okay. Are you personally reviewing incident reports from BOP facilities?
So I sit down with the head of the Office of Internal Affairs and HR every month and go through the list of allegations across the country, and they highlight the most egregious ones. They highlight the numbers. We talk about length of stay as it relates to the investigation.
Are you personally reviewing fatality reports?
I am. I am reviewing the suicide reconstruction reports.
Are you reading suicide reconstruction reports in full?
I am.
In addition to the shortcomings of the PREA audits, and I don't think it's fair to say that they were doing great things when at institutions where leadership was engaged in sexual assault, the audits came back clean. But putting that aside, another key issue that we identified were the shortcomings in the Office of Internal Affairs, and in particular, the multi-thousand case backlog of investigations. What steps have been taken to clear that backlog, and how much progress has been made?
And if I might, just for a second, PREA
Well, my time is very limited.
PREA did great things 20 years ago. That was the point I was trying to make. As it relates to the Office of Internal Affairs, that backlog was something that has been there for a while. We added more than 50 positions to the Office of Internal Affairs. They have now been hired and trained, and we will start seeing that backlog and the timeliness of investigations improve.
What is the state of the backlog today?
I don't have those numbers in front of me, but I can get those for you.
Okay,
Senator.
yeah, by the end of the week, could you please send the committee the total number of backlog cases and your targets for its improvement over the next year?
I can't guarantee you that it'll be by the end of the week, but we will work diligently to get that response back to you.
Okay, well, we'll hope for it quickly. Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, I know there are a couple of members waiting, but I want to ask you about U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta. And Senator Cotton was discussing the staffing issues, the difficulty meeting the presidentially requested and congressionally authorized staffing number, more than 20,000 correctional officers who are meant to be employed by BOP, under 13,000 who are currently on staff, significant issues with the use of augmentation, the inability of personnel to engage in augmentation, for example, over weekends, leading to lockdowns, deficiencies in conditions and service for inmates, staff being put at risk. What specific steps are you taking to ensure that correctional officers can be recruited and hired at competitive salaries and retained?
So we have rolled out retention and recruitment incentives across the country at certain facilities that are really struggling. We've really worked hard to work with an outside consultant to change how we're branding ourselves and marketing ourselves so that we get that solid corrections professional to come into the front door. And this has been a top priority for us over the last year.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Peters, thank you for being here, and thank you for the time that we shared in my office getting an update. Going back to some of Chair Durbin's opening statements, we talked about the work that you're doing in reform, but we have to understand we all play a role in that. I mean, there are $2 billion in maintenance backlog. That's just actually trying to get facilities like Buckner to a point to where the employees have a safe working facility. That doesn't get to any kind of transformation or reform. That just basically gets us to where we should have been to begin with. So we need to make sure as we start asking for reform, what role we're going to play to actually bring it about versus having it discussed every year and really not a lot of progress. I do have to do a little bit of casework. You and I talked about Buckner. I've had 50 complaints in my office from employees at Buckner. We all know the conditions, the roof, the other challenges that we have there. I just need to get an update and see positive trending there. You gave me some hope, but I know that which is not measured seldom gets achieved, and we've got to start tracking this pretty closely. So I just want to make sure I've got your commitment. When I have these constituent inquiries, 50 of them, I can share with you the nature of the complaints. There's about 4 or 5 key areas that I have to get a timely response for the purposes not of your employees, but my constituents. They're playing a dual role there. Do I have your commitment to make sure that you can do that in an expeditious manner?
Senator, we're happy to respond to those requests.
I also think that we need to solve what we know, and I could even see by the reaction in this audience, we got different people here viewing, I particularly noted Senator Cotton's questions, which I tend to agree with. But we've got a disconnect between management and the people in the facility. We have to see people getting to a table and resolving that disconnect. Do I have your commitment to be one of the people that's going to be moving towards having the right discussion with the executive staff at Buckner, the union officials, employees, and other stakeholders to make progress on this challenge?
Senator, we continue our conversations with our national union. I do rely on the local warden and our regional director to have those conversations locally. But with the incoming president, we plan and have already discussed to continue the same conversations we had with Shane Fauci on his.
Well, it's sort of like Congress. If you're not talking, you're not making progress, and we need to be sure that there are good faith discussions going on to make progress. I also want to thank everybody that works in the facility at Buckner and across the system, particularly the corrections officers for the work you're doing. That's why I wore this flag today. You're a part of the blue, and I back the blue. I also want to talk about something that relates to Senator Graham's questions and I think loosely to Senator Cotton's, and it has to do on the biological gender versus a gender that requires you to make a decision. I think it's very important to get the information that Senator Graham asked for, just how many. I want to know, and I want to know in either direction, whether it's a biological male who is being considered transferred to a female facility or any biological female who's requested being transferred to a male facility. I also wanted to know if that, you said the community standard of care, is that something that is overseen by the BOP Transgender Executive Council?
That would be part of their deliberations, that community standard of care, as they determine what is medically necessary.
Okay, so I'm curious about, I think it was the first of its kind, if it's not, correct me, but I think it was inmate Langen, a neo-Nazi who helped found the Aryan Republican Army, convicted of bank robbery in 1997. In September 2021, I think, sought approval, and in January of 2023 received gender reassignment. Medical procedure, and I guess has subsequently dropped a case because he felt like she felt like the BOP did not properly execute facial hair removal. Has that been resolved? Is that the only case of its kind, or are there other cases like this in the BOP?
Senator, I'm not familiar with this individual patient, but we would be happy to look into it and get back to you.
Yeah, well, I'm just curious if it's a first of a kind or if it's something. It made me think about to ask this question because we were also we're trying to get the data from that Senator Graham asked. But is this something that we're going to see more of? Has it become systematized, and could we potentially see more of it. And, quite honestly, you're going to be hard-pressed for me to find someone who is convicted of a serious crime to then receive taxpayer dollars to allow this transition when we've heard about all the limited resources for the hardworking people in the Bureau of Prisons. So I'd like to know whether or not we actually have people in Bureau of Prisons who think that prioritizing the expenditure of dollars for convicted felons should take priority in a world of scarce resources over all the things we're dealing with at Buckner and across the system. I'll follow up with questions for the record. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Tillerson. I might say to the director, I'd like to complete the list of things related to this topic, particularly which medical services are being provided pursuant to court order. I believe that is a fact and a situation. And also the incidence of abuse against those who are transgender women who remain in male prisons. We want safety for all, and that would include them as well.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, Chairman. Director, last year we talked about my bipartisan bill that Senator Cornyn and I put forward to ensure that women in custody receive access to the prenatal and postpartum care that they need. The bill would establish care standards for how federal facilities treat pregnant and postpartum women in custody while ensuring they have access to critical health care and nutritional services. Did you have a chance to look at that, and do you agree that we should ensure that pregnant women in custody receive health care? Could you just give me a status report on what's happening there?
I can, Senator. So yes, I did read the bill following the last hearing and read it again in prep for this one, so thank you. In February of 2022, the Federal Bureau of Prisons issued the Management of Pregnant and Postpartum Offenders with technical guidance in there that I think speaks parallel to your bill. Some of the things I'll just mention is we are careful not to restrain pregnant or postpartum women. Women have the opportunity to bond with their children. We offer them what we call the MINT program, the Mothers and Infants Together program, at 5 community-based facilities. In the event that the women can't leave the Federal Bureau of Prisons and bond with their child in that community setting, we do have an intergovernment agreement with the state of Washington, who does have a residential parenting program. And then we also offer women who remain in the institution an opportunity to engage in prenatal and postpartum parenting programming to assist them in raising those children from inside.
Okay. I know one of the things in the bill is requiring BOP to transfer inmates experiencing high-risk pregnancies to a facility that can provide them adequate care. Is that part of the standards that you have?
It is, Senator. Yes, we have a facility specifically for women who are at high risk.
Okay. I have heard from constituents about staffing shortages and I'm sure you've seen this around the country, various other industries and entities are as well, but specifically at Bureau of Prison facilities in Minnesota. These reports have been corroborated by an OIG report released this May that found significant staffing shortages at the Federal Correctional Institute in Waseca, Minnesota. These staffing shortages have resulted in officers working large amounts of overtime and non-correctional officer employees, including cooks and teachers and nurses, being forced to fill in under that process, I believe, called augmentation. And you know, I'm a big believer in doing a lot more on workforce outside of the prisons, and it's everything from workforce training to doing more on work permits and immigration reform. But could you talk about what steps you are doing to ensure that augmentation is used appropriately?
Thank you. So, our employees, and many of them are in the room, could speak to this. We're exhausted before the pandemic, and then the labor market got worse, and views of law enforcement changed, and so recruitment and retention has been an issue. It's been a top priority of ours. We consulted with 2 external organizations to help us understand our staffing issue and change how we market and brand ourselves to bring additional people in. We've seen improvement. We had a 60% increase in those that applied to the organization in the last year and a 20% decrease in separations. So we are not where we need to be to end augmentation and overtime, but we are making progress.
What steps can Congress take to help states that want to address the issue of understaffing at BOP facilities?
I believe that there are two categories. One, help us sell who we are and what we're about, and that the Federal Bureau of Prisons is an amazing place to work, because I believe it is. There are heroes behind me who do amazing work every single day. And any help with the labor market. I mean, that is, as you mentioned, everyone is struggling right now. And it's just compounded in law enforcement and correction.
Yeah, I actually visited this facility once that I referred to, and I left with that feeling in terms of the work the employees were doing, but also the inmates, the skills they were learning, and just the energy in terms of what they could do with those skills when they got out, which we have to be thinking about as well in terms of our workforce. That obviously, with exception of very violent offenders and people who are in for life, as they should be, there are a number of people that are going to get out that are in there for different kinds of offenses that we want to make sure are learning these skills. One last question. What is the Bureau of Prisons doing to mitigate the negative effects that some of this understaffing has on the mental health of BOP employees?
Yeah, these are very complex and difficult jobs, and then when you're engaged in overtime and augmentation, that mental health and that physical struggle gets even greater. So in the last year, we've changed and modified some of our employee wellness policies to increase resources to our employees, to ensure that our crisis teams have more availability and access to our employees and assist them following an incident. We've also changed our practice so that retirees can access these resources, and that's just the beginning. We will continue to work on employee wellness, both physical and mental health.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Director, thank you so much for being here with us today. I do appreciate it. As you would expect, I want to talk about Memphis.
Yes.
And our concerns we have there. There are so many structural problems, and yesterday the Memphis staff met with my team, and we heard about the facility there. You and I've discussed this previously, the leaking roof, and I know you have said you're going to have a trip to Memphis in October. But I would hope, following our meeting and following the way the employees at Memphis have highlighted with you these problems, that you've got a timeline for addressing these problems, and that has not lingered. And I would be hopeful that you are not waiting on the trip to Memphis to decide to address these. And we've got the Memphis employees here with us today, and I'm pleased that they are here. So talk to me about a timeline for addressing these issues. And we also found out that the SHU, the Special Housing Unit yesterday, is basically a condemned building. So what is your timeline for addressing that? What's the plan of action that these employees can return to Memphis and say, help is on the way?
Senator, thank you, and we've talked about this in your office. I don't have the timeline in front of me, but I know we discussed it in your office, and I know they're making progress. I know the employees that are here, I'm sure they're convinced progress is not fast enough. We are constantly reprioritizing which structures need to be fixed, but I know that we have plans in place at Memphis. I assure you, we are not waiting to fix the facility structure for my visit. Those plans will continue on the cadence that they are supposed to be on, and I look forward to visiting the facility.
Could you get in writing that timeline to me so that these employees know when that help is going to be arriving, they know when to expect it, and that they know that you all are indeed going to follow through on
Yes,
this?
Senator.
Okay, and if I could get that within the week, that would be very helpful.
Senator, we'll work diligently to get that to you.
Great. Let's also talk about the drones, because I know Memphis is understaffed. You and I had discussed the drones, and you said there was one drone that had been apprehended. I think that when we talk about drugs in our facilities, and there's been conversation in the questions here today about that, this creates a problem for the staff. And if these drones are flying in at night, and we are understaffed at night, but we know they're bringing in illicit drugs. What is your plan specifically on addressing the drones?
Thank you, Senator. So we are working on, we are utilizing managed access systems which capture all cellular signals within the confines of a prison. We are utilizing micro-jamming systems to jam all cellular signals. We are deploying and looking at cellular communications as defined by a geospatial area. So that's a lot of technical language to say we're leveraging the latest technology to ensure that we can handle what you describe very accurately is a very serious situation with the drones. And the technology is constantly changing, and we're just trying to stay ahead of that changing technology.
It's a hard thing to do. I also want to ask you about home confinement and those federal prisoners that were put into home confinement during the CARES Act. And of course, the COVID pandemic is over, but you decided to go ahead and leave these individuals in home confinement rather than have them returned to the facilities. These are convicted criminals. They are serving their sentence. So where did you get the authority to decide to leave them on home confinement, and why did you choose not to return these? What was your decision matrix on that?
So I used data to make that decision in collaboration with the department. So we released over 13,000 individuals under the CARES Act, with less than 0.5% of them returning to prison. And so they were successful in the community. And so we made the decision to keep what I think today's date are about 3,300 individuals in the community, hoping that they would be better served in that situation than returning to prison.
Well, I find it interesting that DOJ thought they had the authority to give you the authority to do that and to make that decision to allow them, even though the emergency has ended. It is over. And it seems that these prisoners should go back to prison to serve the balance of that sentence. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks for being here, Director Peters, and thanks for the meeting that we had. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Senator.
As you know, I was very involved in establishing the time credits under the First Step Act to help people prepare for successful release into the community by participating in programs that create that good effect prior to their release, including programs like addiction treatment and job training and family reconciliation. You have moved from manually calculating those credits, which was kind of a mess, to an automatic system. How's the transition from manual to automatic gone? Can we put those issues behind us, or do you still have concerns about the automatic system?
Thank you, Senator. So it didn't roll out as smoothly as we had hoped. We had some technical glitches as we rolled it out. We also intend to front-load the earned time credits so that those in our custody understand, if they continue to engage in programming and treatment, kind of what the carrot is out there for them. And we found recently that we're having technical difficulties with the front-loading of those earned time credits as well. So it has gotten better. It's not smooth and it's not perfect yet, but we'll get there.
Okay, if you could expand on that a bit in a written answer to me, just to fill in some additional details, I'd appreciate that. It appears that the program has been generally successful. I think the latest data that is available to us is as of January, the end of January of this year, that 13,500 individuals had been released from residential reentry centers, home confinement, and secure facilities with First Step Act earned time credits, and that compared to a 43% recidivation rate for the overall BOP population, they had that recidivation rate for the First Step population was only 12.4%. That suggests that the program is generally successful, but as you know, the First Step Act contemplates a multiplicity of potential programs. Are there preliminary results, or are you looking at which programs seem to be producing the best results within the suite of eligible programs, and what can you tell us about where the most successful areas are?
Thank you, Senator. So from January to August of this year, we had almost 23,000 individuals leave through FSA. So that number is a little bit bigger because we were able to capture that August data. And the recidivism numbers that you present are accurate. So we do know this works. We have over 110 evidence-based reduction programs and productive activities, and we are going to continue to grow that number. And our research department is looking at studying which ones are more effective than others. I don't have that data in front of me today, but we certainly can get back to you.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. I think, there's a certain amount of time that it makes sense to take to make sure you have a sufficiently robust data pool.
That's right.
So that you can draw those correct conclusions. But I really would appreciate it if you would keep in touch with me on that process. And I guess the best way to do that is to get an update as to where you feel we are right now as a question for the record in this hearing. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Peters, for being here and for your service.
Thank you, Senator.
Nearly 1 year ago, we held a hearing. I think we're 2 weeks shy of being 1 year from that hearing. Immediately following that hearing, I submitted a short list of questions to you and have not yet received a response. It was during that hearing that a couple of my colleagues asked you about timely responses to questions from this committee, and you acknowledged that it was important to do that. Can you tell me why you haven't responded to my questions yet? These are not difficult questions, and most of our nominees respond within a week or so of getting them.
Thank you, Senator. So I, too, am disappointed that those questions, for the record, have not yet been answered. We have been working on them diligently over the last year. It has been a lot of back and forth with the department. I was hoping that they would be cleared this week. They're not yet. That being said, we have done other things. We've increased the number of employees in our legislative affairs, so the individual requests that we have received over the last year.
Can you tell me when I can
timely.
receive a response to those questions?
I don't have a specific date for you,
Okay.
Senator, but I know we're working on them.
Okay, I'd appreciate it if you could get back to me by the end of this month. That would be 1 year from the date of the hearing, and I don't think that's too much to ask. One of the reasons I'm asking about this, and I hate to pester you on that, it's just we do need answers to those questions. They're important. Among the questions that have been asked of you relate to how we separate out male and female prisoners. We do this for good reasons, reasons that relate to human biology, differences between the sexes, and there are a lot of questions that we have about how we do this. It's quite concerning that the number of female inmates who have become pregnant during the course of their confinement in BOP custody is not zero. And it's even more concerning that a substantial number of those pregnancies are the result of the BOP forcing female prisoners to share their facilities with biologically male prisoners. It's really concerning. Now, in January of 2022, the Bureau of Prisons adopted definitions that have an impact in the area that I'm asking about. Definitions for words like gender, gender nonconforming, gender affirming, and cisgender. For example, the Bureau of Prisons must now look at gender as, quote, a construct used to classify a person as male, female, both, or neither. Gender encompasses aspects of social identity, psychological identity, and human behavior, close quote. Now, I understand there are lots of feelings, lots of different beliefs about those things. But what I find most alarming about this is that notably absent from that list are things that you might expect to see, that you might think should at least be taken into account. Things like biological sex, like reproductive organs, the presence of a Y chromosome, or something as simple as a 5 o'clock shadow or an Adam's apple. Is biology now a verboten subject when you determine which prison you're going to send a prisoner to be incarcerated in? Is that now off limits?
No, Senator. In fact, I would present to you today that the majority of those in our care and custody are housed in facilities based on their chromosomal distinctions.
The majority of them, as we've always done, and as any sane prison system always would. The majority of them, it's good to know. But why not all of them? Why would you ever subject female inmates in particular, who face a series of biological disadvantages relative to male prisoners, face a number of vulnerabilities that male prisoners don't face? Why would you ever subject female inmates to being incarcerated against their will with biologically male prisoners? Can you tell me when that's ever justified?
So we also recognize, as do many experts, that a person may identify as a different gender than their biological one, and we recognize that at the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
Okay, but a prisoner, as I understand it, need only convince a single Bureau of Prisons psychologist to sign a form to have their identity considered for a transfer. Just one person. And the request then has to be approved, but that's really all that has to happen. It's almost a turnkey situation. They convince one psychologist and the whole process is set in motion. And yet, it's my understanding that BOP doesn't publish statistics on the number of inmates who are assigned to a prison that doesn't conform with their biological sex. Why is that?
So, Senator, while that frontline counselor starts the process is very complex. It's a multidisciplinary team that includes experts from psychology and health services and corrections that make that final determination around
So why
housing.
doesn't it publish the statistics?
Senator, I don't know why we don't publish the statistics, but I can look into that and
Okay,
get back to you.
that would be great. If you would publish that, I would appreciate it. Now, some have estimated that the number is around 1,300 as of January 2022. To the extent that that estimate was even in the ballpark, it's undoubtedly higher now, the longer that this stays intact. That is not an insubstantial number, especially when you consider the fact that most prisoners in America are not in BOP custody. That is, most prisoners are serving a sentence issued by a state court for an offense under state law, not federal. It's a really large number, and it's very concerning considering the number of pregnancies that take place, the number of heinous circumstances that can result from this, and in fact have resulted from them. I see my time has expired. I've got other questions to ask you on this and other topics, including implementation of the First Step Act. I will submit those in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Cruz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Peters, one of President Biden's first acts after taking office was to issue Executive Order 14006, mandating that contracts with privately owned detention facilities not be renewed. The order is intended, quote, to decrease incarceration levels by reducing profit-based incentives to incarcerate by phasing out the federal government's reliance on privately operated criminal detention facilities. This order has created many unintended consequences, including the closing of the Willacy County Regional Detention Facility in Raymondville, Texas. The decision has had tremendous negative consequences with little to no obvious upside, forcing inmates to travel hundreds of miles round trip for court appearances, impacting the accessibility of legal counsel, and making family visits significantly more difficult. It has also caused administration issues for the prison system and harmed the local economy by eliminating these jobs. Literally every stakeholder that has a role to play in these cases is opposed to this Biden policy. That includes the defense bar, the federal public defender, the U.S. attorney, even the federal bench. All have publicly asked for this policy to be rescinded. Unfortunately, as with the open borders under Joe Biden, the Biden administration doesn't give a damn about how their woke policies actually affect South Texas or the lives of regular people. Ms. Peters, how has Executive Order 14006 impacted the Bureau of Prisons' ability to house inmates, and has it been a negative impact or a positive impact?
Thank you, Senator. So we were able to come into compliance with the executive order the end of last November and bring in those individuals from those facilities that were closed, and we were able to safely absorb them into our current population.
Okay, that you didn't answer my question. How has it impacted the BOP, and has it been positive or negative?
Senator, I don't know that I can put it in a positive or negative category. What I can say
is the defense bar and the U.S. attorney and the federal bench, are they all wrong?
I'm not familiar with their opinions and their reasons for opposing.
Okay, unfortunately, you're illustrating that the Biden administration doesn't care about South Texas if you don't even know the impact it's having on all the stakeholders. All right, let's shift to the topic Senator Lee was just asking you about, because I have to say I found your answers to him thoroughly unacceptable. The 2022 Transgender Offender Manual, issued by the Bureau of Prisons through your predecessors, reverted back to the Obama administration's initial designation and housing programming assignments. Notably, biological sex at birth is no longer the controlling determinant. Right now today, how many biological males are housed in female prisons under BOP?
Senator, I don't have those numbers in front of me today.
Why don't you?
We could look at them and get back to you.
Why don't you?
I just don't have them top of
Did you know you were going to be asked that today?
No, Senator.
Oh, you didn't. Have you been asked that before?
On the record, Senator?
Yes.
I don't recall.
You were asked a year ago in writing, and you failed to answer it in writing. You knew damn well you're going to be asked it today, but you don't want to answer it. Senator Lee asked, why don't you report the numbers? You don't report the numbers because you don't want people to know the numbers. So the fact that you sit there and say, I don't know, he said 1,300. Is that number in the ballpark?
1,300 as it relates to which category, Senator?
Biological males housed in female prisons.
No, that would be a much larger number.
Which is a larger number?
So the number of individuals who even identify as transgender at the Federal Bureau of Prisons is around 1,700. And the number of individuals that are housed in institutions not conforming with their biological sex are very low.
Very low. Are we talking 100? Are we talking 10?
We will look at the numbers. We're talking less than 10.
So your testimony here, I just want to understand, your testimony here today is there are fewer than 10 biological males, human beings that were born male, who are housed in female prisons. Is that your testimony?
That is my understanding, and I will confirm that and get back to you.
Okay. Of the 1,700 prisoners you referenced, how many of them are convicted sex offenders?
I do not know the answer to that, Senator.
Are you aware that Great Britain's numbers, according to a January 2022 report, is the proportion of male-born transgender offenders who are sex offenders in the UK prison system is roughly 60%, significantly higher than the 18% of the general population? Are those numbers consistent with the American numbers?
I'm not familiar with Great Britain's numbers.
So let me ask you this. How many female inmates have been sexually assaulted by biological males who BOP has housed in female prisons?
Senator, I would have to look into that and get back to you.
Do you have an obligation to protect those female prisoners?
Absolutely.
And so have you examined how many women have been sexually assaulted by biological males that BOP has placed in the prison with those women?
I have not, Senator, but I will tell you that safety and security and the placement of every individual in our custody is top of mind and the most important.
So if it's top of mind, why haven't you examined how many have been sexually assaulted? This is an obvious question. If you put a man with male genitals, with a male body in a female prison who's a convicted sex offender, it's not rocket science that there's a real risk those women are going to be victims of sexual assault. How is it possible that you haven't even asked the question, how many women are getting sexually assaulted because of the policies of the Biden administration?
Senator, I assure you that safety and security of these individuals are top of mind. And if
So you haven't asked the question?
If there was misconduct, those individuals would be held accountable.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. As you probably have noted, this is the Senate Judiciary Committee with a subspecialty in transgender politics. It seems that every time we have a hearing, we're talking about transgender. I know it's a topic of great concern to my colleagues, and they're welcome to ask their questions. We estimate that 0.5% of the population of the United States is transgender. You would think it were a lot larger in light of some of the attention being paid to the issue. But having said that, I want to go back to the point that was made by Senator Graham. We're talking about the safety of all prisoners, regardless of their cisgender, whether they're going through transition or any other circumstances. We also understand that we are dealing with the possibility of those who identify as transgender being victimized. I'd like to ask the director, has that been an issue?
Senator, it has not been an issue that has risen to my level.
Well, what we have been told is that transgender women held in male facilities are uniquely vulnerable, and according to the Justice Department, are abused at higher rates than other population. Pursuant to PREA, U.S. prisons already house many women who are transgender in women's facilities where they are safest. Safety of the prisoners is the highest priority, regardless. I see you nodding in agreement. You said that earlier.
I agree.
So if you would clarify some of the questions that were asked earlier, I would appreciate that very much. I want to address a couple other issues that came up here. One of the senators suggested we needed a second panel this year. I tried that last year, and I won't name names, but some of the senators did not return for the second panel. I am meeting with the National Union this afternoon, and I keep in touch with them on a regular basis, and will continue to. I also note that we seem to have bipartisan agreement, which I want to make sure is headlined, that the BOP needs significantly more funding for staffing, building maintenance, and repairs, and other critical needs. Let's see if that translates into a bipartisan request for appropriations to match with that. You have an important job. You've been told a lot of different things today. I would tell you that senators really take it personally when you don't answer their questions. It's more than almost any other thing, and I would recommend that you make that a high priority. It will lead to more comfortable circumstances in our next meeting if you can do that. And I thank you for your service, and with no further questions to come before the committee, we stand adjourned.
Thank you, sir.